Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone. We are here today for this conversation, this kōrero, to explore these wonderful instruments. The Taonga Puoro, singing treasures, the traditional instruments of Māori that were almost lost, were revived and are now finding new directions, even in chamber music. And we have a wonderful panel of speakers here. Gillian Whitehead is a preeminent New Zealand composer who's worked with these instruments to bring their sounds into the chamber music world. Rob Thorne is many things, but an anthropologist and a highly regarded practitioner of these instruments. And Rob, of course, is performing this afternoon in the concert here at 2 p.m. And my old mate, Brian Flintoff. Brian is a master carver, a master maker of these instruments. And in fact, Brian was part of the original group that commenced the revival, Hau Manu. We've got a lot to explore today. And I thought we could start, though. I'd like to put a question to all of you. But before I do, perhaps I can explain that basically we're having a conversation and you're eavesdropping. Is that okay? Because it feels a bit formal up here, but really that's what we're doing.
But if they have questions...
Yeah, I tell you what, we'll have questions at the end. So save up your questions, think about anything you'd like to ask. And in case I forget, what we're going to do at the end as well is we'll put some of the instruments out. I know Rob is busy with rehearsals, but we'll put instruments out so people can have a close look and ask more personal questions there. The question I have for you is to do with first contact with the instruments. I'd like to ask you where you first heard an instrument, where you saw it or heard about it, and what your reaction was. So can I start with you, Gillian?
Yes, my very first encounter was, I was a student in Sydney, and I was studying something called ethnomusicology, which was not at that stage what ethnomusicology became later. It was taught by Peter Sculthorpe, and he got us very enthused about instruments in Southeast Asia. From that, I was wondering about instruments here, so I did a very bad thesis, which I then forgot. But then when I heard Richard and Hirini at Ohakune at the Sing Aotearoa Festival, I just couldn't believe, because I believed all those instruments were dead.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
at that stage?
At that stage. Yeah. And it went on from there.
Wow. And so did you, when you heard Richard and Hirini, did you make contact there? Were you moved to then start to think about writing for you?
Yeah, well, I didn't think about writing straight away. It was a few years later, I was in Melbourne at a Composing Women's Festival, and Tungia Baker was there. Mm-hmm. And she told me a story about Waka and Kowhai. And I woke up in the middle of the night and thought, of course, I could tell that story using Richard, using the improvising pianist Judy Bailey, Georg Pedersen, cellist, and that went on and became a CD, and that was, it all started from that.
Wow. That's, yeah, Rob, how about you?
Kia ora koutou. I think for me it was 1999, so I'm hitting my 20-year mark. So just a baby, eh? And a friend of mine in the community, my wife had just become pregnant with our first child, and she had a ko'owo, and she had never managed, she'd made it in a workshop with someone, and she'd never managed to play it. And she showed it to me and asked if I could get a sound out of it, and I was a trumpeter from the age of 10.
Okay.
Well, I was a trumpeter for 3 years, until the age of 13. So I trumpeted it because I didn't know about oblique flutes or... and she was unusually impressed and gave it to me.
Yeah.
And then I went from there. I think in terms of human contact, my first contact was probably an email to Brian, where I was interested in making my own, and had this thought around the way that I had no power tools or anything like that, so this idea around how we made them in the old days must have been simple, without, power tools or anything. So I contacted Brian and asked him if he knew of any makers close to me. He sent me a 5-point bulletin list on how to make a ko'owo and told me that I was the closest maker to myself now.
That sounds awfully familiar.
I was brought up with the old Scottish saying from down in south, and the easiest way to get a helping hand is to look down at the end of your arm.
So, Brian, your first contact. Now, we know each other very well, but I don't know the answer to this question.
I was teaching myself bone carving, and wanted to extend it beyond just making pendants, and saw pictures in books and had seen some instruments in museums, because I've always been a lover of museums, and tried making one that I had to give away. You have a special box for duds, yes, that you keep secret. So I tried again, and because we didn't know much about it, I sent it up to the Māori Arts Department in Wellington, and they didn't know anybody who could help me. And so this is just what Gillian was saying. It was right at that stage when we thought it had died out, but then a few Māori people were teaching themselves to play again. And so gradually we picked up a bit more information, and then I was teaching at the time and found myself out at a wānanga or teaching thing at Motueka on the marae, and met Richard Nuns there because he was a teacher too, and of course we were invited to go along because we could get hold of tape recorders. So we were there to tape the sessions, and as in between times we found we both had an interest, and Richard, being a very expert flute player, was no good at making, and I, learning to make, was no good at playing. But we managed to turn that lack of skill that I had in being poor at playing so that Richard knew that if I could get a sound out of an instrument, it would play beautifully for him. But I couldn't play them myself, and I'm sure that when I would make a new instrument and he'd come out to see me and he would play it, but then when he went away, he took the music with him, and the instrument wouldn't sing anymore. That was mean of him. But together we had this partnership, and were invited by Māori artists and writers to the first wānanga on Taonga Puoro, held up in the North Island, and there we met Hirini Melbourne, who was along as a student, having heard that, and he'd had a dream for years and years about reviving them, but just hadn't had the impetus to get started and people to back him up. And so he invited Richard and I to join him in the revival. And so the three of us were the spearhead, but we quickly gathered together lots of other enthusiasts, and nowadays there's a great group of makers and players, and I'm sure that they're not going to go hiding like they did for so many years again. And in the meantime, we found one older person who had been taught to play the puturino, this long flute that's unique to Aotearoa, and he hadn't played that for years. Right. And so that was the only person who'd been taught to play up the Wanganui River, Māori tirakatni, as a boy, and this instrument chose him. And that's the lovely part about all of these instruments, that Māori see everything as being a person. And so the flute is a person, the music that comes out of it is a person, everything becomes a person, and that's a key to whatever we do in the revival of Taonga Puoro.
Brian, you I know you've told the story of how Hirani and Richard and yourself, maybe I should explain to our friends from overseas, you may not know, Hirani passed away some years ago, and Richard unfortunately is very unwell now. He can't join us today. But I wondered if you could just share with us those journeys you made around the marae, which are the meeting houses of Māori back then, and some of the responses because you were exploring instruments that you didn't know what the sound should be or would have been, I should say. You know, how was that?
That was, well, the wisdom of Hirani and the people who guided him was invaluable, and for the revival, Hirani took the concept back to marae, so that the revival came back from the Māori people. But in doing so, there were some wonderful things happen. Even at the very first wānanga we had, Te Papa sent a cardboard box with a whole lot of Taonga Puoro from their collection, just lying in a box. A bit different nowadays. And one of their staff members brought it along, and we had these instruments. And before we started, we'd been talking to some of the old people and the kuia who gathered round and were, I think, a bit more bold than the men at the stage to come and ask questions. And we'd ask them, you know, what do you know about a puturino, for instance? And, oh, very little. And we asked about some of the instruments, and no, don't know anything about that. But then when Richard and Hirani stood up to play them, you could see their eyes light up, and the sounds generated memories that they didn't know they had. In fact, Richard and I, both being Pākehā, and after the performance and that, the people would come up and start telling us things, and their whānau would gather round and say, hey, why are you telling these Pākehā that? You haven't told us, your family. We didn't know. And so it's a wonderful aspect of revival that has become noted worldwide in the big long word that you said, ethnomusicology world. It was something that we hadn't planned, but to be included as part of that was life-changing, and there are so many lessons in it that can be life-changing for all of us. The way we look at nature, everything's a person. The tree's a tree person, the bird's a bird person, the sounds of the music. In fact, I carve on this little instrument here, the kawawa, which is the most common of the instruments. I carve on one end the face, and that's the face of the instrument, And of course, after a while, it has to get named. And at the other end is the face of the music, which has two noses, because to play the instrument, you must bring your nose and its nose together, as in a hongi, which is a sharing of breath. So you share your breath with the instrument, and make music. And at the other end, that's identified by the face having two noses, and the music is the shared breath. It's a beautiful way of looking at music, isn't it? And of course, musicians name their instruments in exactly the same way all around the world. They have that same feeling. I suppose it's been part of a tradition of music forever.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering if we could touch on how the music would have been played pre-European times. And Rob, you're an anthropologist, and would you like to comment? I mean, as I understand it, the instruments were used for important purposes. Do you have any thoughts?
Thanks, Brian. That was great. I guess I'm kind of conflicted, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay.
I think this is actually part of my role as an academic, is to be conflicted and to consider the possibilities. As a musician and a player, rather than an academic, I come from an embodied perspective. So I believe that as a Māori, I do today what I would have done then. So I work from an intuitive foundation where I listen, because that's literally most of what being a musician is. And in the process of playing, of course, I listen to myself. I listen to the instrument, and then I listen to how it works in the wider context. In terms of how things were played in the old days, of course, these instruments all had particular functions, which I think is very important to remember and to consider. But I sense sometimes that this perspective actually marginalises the powerful and intuitive beauty of the music that the instruments actually have the potential for. So I like to work, for instance, I like to work from a musical perspective rather than one of sound. I think of what comes out of the instruments is music rather than sound, and I think that function in terms of ritual and ceremony tends to be considered from a sound perspective rather than a music perspective. It's like that there's a discussion in musicology and ethnomusicology around noisemakers. It's interesting what people can build discussions out of. But this idea of how a karanga manu isn't actually a musical instrument because it has a function which is to call birds. And so you use it to call birds. And I think that this perspective denies that perspective that our whānau, the birds and the trees they all make music from their personality and their character. If we were to look at a tree from a functional perspective as a human, we'd be looking at how it produces oxygen and maybe not considering the shade that it makes on a hot day. So I'm conflicted. I think it's very important, these ceremonial aspects. But I'm constantly reminded by how we as Māori marginalise ourselves. And I think that this is just one layer. The traditional layer is, for me, my responsibility lies in the future. And I must work into that. I come from a tradition, but every step that I take is forward. And I've done a lot of walking into the past because of the research that I've done. But, of course, I'm also walking backwards into the future.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, Gillian, that probably brings us to how do you need to tread carefully when you write for these instruments? How, what's your view on this connection with the past and the?
Well, I've always been very careful. I don't like. For instance, if you were to ask me to write a piece for Koawa without anything else, I don't know that I could do it because there's no context. That first piece I wrote was storytelling, and in a way, every piece I write is storytelling. Whether it's about whales, and in a piece about whales, all the instruments are made of whalebone, and that whalebone has been gifted to Brian or, to
other carvers.
Yes, and the same with other pieces. And if it's somebody's story, I make sure I have contact with the owners of the story and their blessing, because otherwise I can't do it. So
that connection is there. You're aware of that.
Oh, very
that
much, all the time.
Yeah.
And also when I'm writing, the music, the non-Taonga Puoro aspect, I always try to write something that it's not reproducing, but it reflects pre-European sound. And something that pre-European here might recognise as a sound that they might recognise, if that makes sense.
Gillian is so humble there. I think you were there up in Rotorua too, were you, when she played, when Richard and others and Aroha performed one of her creations that was based around a story from Aroha Yates Smith's personal whānau family, and everybody there, weren't we? We were just completely mesmerised at the way she melded the traditional stories from those people with the instruments in the way that they would have been played in the old days. And of course, the instruments are like people. And as people, we have two sides. We have our physical side and our spirit side. And the instruments do that, and so they have a very spiritual sound and a spiritual uses, but at the same time they also have the other side, the entertainment. and bringing people together and making people happy and telling stories is the first thing, of course, for the carver, for probably all the arts. The story is the genesis of the work. And it's just wonderful to have it, tautoko, to have it performed and written in the way that Gillian does with respect to all those aspects. Just magic.
Yeah, I think that I think for me, one of the greatest functions of Puoro, because the sound it causes time travel, and it also takes us to places. So there's this psychogeographical thing that happens where you listen to the sound, you listen to the music, and the sound transports you to a place. And it's interesting that a particular time is also a place. And I think that for me, the greatest function of the Puoro is, which I've noticed is what happens, is it changes people. It changes their hearts and it changes their minds about things. It changes often how they feel about themselves. And I think that there's this, we could say therapeutic, but actually I believe that it's more than that, it's healing. And for me, like I'm the conduit as well to my tupuna. So I'm expressing for them through something else. So I'm an instrument, and it's not just healing for us. There are times when I'm overcome with emotion that I know is an expression of my ancestors, and it's their healing that's occurring. So I think for me, and this is the thing about function and ritual and ceremony, it's all about meaning and intention. And if there's one thing that I've really kind of come to understand about the practice, everyday practice of the sacred around the world as an anthropologist, is that it is exactly that. It's every day. It occurs on dirt floors with chickens running around, kids playing, TVs on. This world of the sacred is not separate. It's right there, embedded in our everyday, from between breakfast to washing our hands, to going to work and coming home, kissing our loved ones and having dinner, going to bed. So this is, for me, the greatest traditional function, I believe, that is expressed through the modern work, is that bringing of the sacred into these other contexts.
And
I was sorry.
You mentioned around the world and bringing people together, and really excitingly, simple bone instruments like this are found as the oldest musical instruments in museums nearly all around the world. In fact, we were over in rural France and there was a little museum there, and they had one made out of the same material as this one, a leg bone of a goat. And it was 30,000 odd years old. And of course, because of the simple way they're played, where the whipple that's creating the music is only partly the instrument, the other part is the lips of the player and the tongue of the player, which manipulates that sound. The sound that those instruments made back then is the same sound as they still make. And it's a wonderful thing because it brings us all together, because it's part of our heritage, even if we have to go back 40,000 years.
Brian's not that old, I should say.
Sorry, I was in South Germany last year and had the honour to go to a cave where the oldest musical instrument was discovered. And the oldest musical instrument is a bone flute. Not saying that there weren't instruments older than that, but this is the only existing one that they know of. It was found in hundreds of pieces, and it was put together by a brilliant woman who realised that all these pieces were one thing and built a whole lot of software to build it, and then they glued it back together. But it was a hollow vulture bone. And this is amazing that it's 40,000 years ago, when we were making music, they found, a little sculpture next to it as well on the Venus. But just the fact that we were artists and we were musicians and have been for this long, I think that this is something else, that makes us as Māori, and as anyone that experiences Taonga Puoro, it ties us into something far deeper and greater.
I'm supposed to ask questions today, but I would like to contribute in that I spent a lot of time years ago touring around schools with music programs. And the programs would include a range of instruments, but also some Taonga Puoro. And I was always amazed at how the response to these instruments. And the kids would always be engaged. If I was doing a guitar or a violin or a flute, maybe they'd be engaged, but with these instruments there was a direct connection. And I remember being in a rural school somewhere in the Bickerton area, I think, and there was a little girl there who hadn't responded pretty much to anything. Music, being in school. And I played the ko'oho, and all of a sudden, she came to life. And it was a tiny school, maybe 20 pupils. And so they asked me back year on. And each time, this girl really responded to these sounds. There was some sort of direct connection there. And I think that's what we find. And I'm going to come to you shortly, Gillian, but is that you don't have to have pre-knowledge of these sounds. They connect with us, I believe. And so, and I'm interested, I'm not quite sure what the question is now, Gillian, but you see, in my mind...
Answer your own question.
Ask your own question, yeah, that's the best way. In my mind, you have chamber music, which of course you carefully compose, you carefully curate, and you could argue that the violins and the cellos have that direct connection, but putting the Taonga Puoro in with those more classical instruments, are we layering up things here? Are we layering up some direct connections, or?
Well, I guess...
It's not a good question, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. I'll give an answer which might be to your question or not. If I'm writing a piece, I was writing a piece with Richard, sometimes it was my idea, sometimes it was his, but the idea might be there that we would write a piece for the New Zealand String Quartet and instruments made of goods to honour...
Hinepu Te Hui.
Yeah, thank you. Hinepu Te Hui, who is the goddess of peace, if you like, and the good being something which contains is a symbol of peace.
Indeed.
And so start with that. I'd get the ranges of all the instruments there were, which sometimes involved Richard ringing up and saying, "I've got a new instrument from Brian," and played it down the phone, and you'd sort of write it down. The instruments have very small ranges,
yes.
About the range of a minor third or less, and I would know what pitches would support or contradict that. And if I was using an instrument here and an instrument there, different instrument, a lot of what is going on in the other parts is getting from a set of pitches that support this instrument to a set of pitches that support the next instrument, and so on. So that's a kind of pattern that goes on within the development of the music. And often the music of the other instruments will start or have a lot of connection with the Taonga Puoro. Also, Richard doesn't like reading music. He can, but I think he plays better when he doesn't read music.
I think we all do.
Yeah. So really, I would ask him, ask him to play, maybe give specifications of how he should play. But then I would, because he always improvises, I would get the other players to improvise in a way that to my ear is going to work. Maybe a set of pitches or something that both instruments can accommodate harmonically. And
so what we're talking about here is, and I remember a story from Brian, which I might ask him to share with us shortly, is, of course, all the instruments are individual voices.
Yes.
And of no, obviously they're of a pitch, but this instrument here
quality as
could
well.
be quite different to the pitch of another instrument.
Yes.
It's not like going to Beg's Music and buying a flute, and you know that this key is an A. The pitches are uncertain. So do you write for very specific instruments, or do you say this is the range, this is the sort of instrument with this sort of range that you're looking for?
I was always writing for specific instruments of Richard's, but most of the, a lot of instruments of a certain length are going to be around a certain pitch.
And of course, the instruments can vary, like without moving finger holes.
Yeah.
So you've got that aspect where they can also blend in easier because of the use of the tongue to modulate the pitch. So, that's a great ability of the instruments to mix with the stringed instruments.
And of course you can get
everything
the other
else.
instruments to do the same.
With strings especially, I presume.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Do you think?
I ask the questions right here. No, sorry, Rob.
Do you think that bending was a traditional?
Oh, definitely, yes. The old music was, I think somebody wrote about it early in one of the music books. It was like the Māori had as many notes as in the Western scale, but they jumped them down to the range of notes that you mentioned before, and so they were microtonal. And so when people like me that don't have a good ear hear things that sounds like a chant or a monotone almost, but the Māori ear was so developed to these tiny, tiny variations in sound that, of course, when they heard European music, they could just harmonise without thinking about it, because there was high development, and it wasn't, although it was in a small group, one instrument would be up there, and as Gillian says, another instrument's way down here with the lowest tone. So, yes, is that what you're thinking about? That I do believe that the Māori also in the old days, there was records of them hearing European people when they were out working in the fields or something, and they were whistling. And we were just... because music to them didn't exist without words. So the words or the story, of course, which is what the words are, was the integral part, and the Taonga Puoro from some of the records show that they were used as the icing on the cake. They were used to embellish the singer's song originally.
And some of the old motutu, but please correct me if I'm wrong, the motutu, the chants, are a similar range, are they not, in terms of pitch range to some of these instruments?
I don't know, actually.
I mean, I don't think the human voice obviously has a very large range of pitch, but those old motutu that I've heard are sitting within the sort of range you'd expect to get from a koalo. And nobody's ever actually said, yes, that's right.
But it's also very similar to the range of birds here, bird song.
Yes.
So,
which is a strong connection.
This is interesting though, right? Because the instruments are similar to the birds, or the birds are similar to the instruments. Like I have a tui in my garden that sings my microwave oven. and so, and the car alarm, the thing. So I think that's it's a two-way street.
I was doing some bird recording. I like to do environment recording. And I had this wonderful tui, doing its thing one day, and I thought, oh, wow. And then the next thing it does, one of the Nokia phone calls, I saw Helen there, and Helen Fisher, and I'm reminded of a story, and this will lead to a question for you, Gillian. At Takuwana, and this was a wonderful piece, complicated piece, choirs, orchestra, a piece for Irish bagpipes, which I played and was terrified over.
And he said, it's wonderful.
And Richard was in this as well, and he was looking really happy. And I asked him, I said, so why are you so happy? I'm absolutely terrified at playing, this piece, because I'm not used to reading music. I'm not used to following a conductor, but I took it on Helen because And he said, you know how Richard... He said, they just give me a gap and I'll fill it. You see, this was his response. But so the question is, Richard's part in a score, what does it look like? What do you say, how is it, or is it the conversation you have beforehand?
More conversation, asking him, perhaps to improvise with somebody, and it was all done with a series of signals, that he knew his score was really a list of instruments, and he would be cued in and possibly cued out, or he would cue the next player. And in the early performances of pieces, there was generally a kind of pause. But as the piece had more performances, it would become much more seamless. And hopefully you don't know whether it's improvised or written.
These pauses, though, are beautiful.
Well, yes, some of them are. But when there's a pause where you're obviously waiting for someone else to start, it's a bit...
My pause is usually filled with...
I'm aware of the time, and I'd like to have some questions from the floor. But just again around Robin about, are we comfortable that maybe not the tradition, but the instruments are alive and well and will continue? And I'd just like to throw that around just to wind up our part, and then we'll ask for questions.
Very hard to know. I mean, we don't know anything much about the future. They're alive and well now, but where is the younger generation coming up behind your generation?
Well, there's 2 younger generations after me already.
There are already?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
I mean, it's in NCEA. I'm developing a performance paper for the New Zealand School of Music, which is going to be run for a second time this year, which is about playing, which is actually very difficult for them, for the students, because it's not just performance. I mean, it's an improv paper, so it's composition as well. I'm very confident. I mean, the story about the Ice Age flute, these instruments they're born to last. You don't need to plug them in for a start, so they're post-apocalyptic. But yeah, I mean, when I first started teaching in schools in the early 2000s and taking my instruments out to kids, from here to kids as old as me now, the little ones would come up and ask questions like, oh, what's this? I have a great story which is completely unrelated, but I think is a beautiful story about me turning up to a kindy, and the little boy came running up to me and he said, "Where's your cape?" And I said, "My cape? I don't have a cape." And he said, "Oh, well, you're not the magician then." But they would come up to me and they would say, "What are these? What are these?" And nowadays, 20 years later, I take my instruments out and they all line up and they go, "Oh, we've got one of these at home," or "I heard this was played down at the marae in the weekend," or "Oh, that's this instrument, that's a pūtātara, this is a pūtorino, my uncle's got one of them." It's all on now. And it's a beautiful thing, especially around the found sound aspect of Puoro. So this is found. This is found sound. I found this as it is on a beach. So it was played once. And just the shells, and you teach people these things, and it's... Sorry?
I think the question was, would you play it for us now? And we'll listen, you see.
Sure.
Sorry to do this to you, Rob. So, do you mind? I think we'll open the floor to questions now, seeing as we've got one already, and I believe we might have a person with a roving microphone. Please treat it like an ice cream. You can't get too close to it.
I'm a little nervous. I'm not a public speaker, but I want to say that I think this is Waitangi Day as it should be. I want to thank you for coming and giving us this amazing talk. I hope you can spread your wonderful knowledge and have more talks like this to unite us.
Thank you.
Are you able to do that?
Yes, now it's a question. The answer is yes. Is that sufficient?
I have to be invited first or I'll never shut up.
And next question, please. We'll share them around. There we are.
In Australia, women are not allowed to play the didgeridoo. Does that apply here?
Hine Rokatodi is a woman. So the goddess of flute music is a woman.
Hine Rokatodi was a goddess who loved her flute so much that she decided she would live inside it so that she wouldn't have to be parted from it. But of course, there was a cost to that. And she had to turn herself into the humble little case moth that we see hanging from some of our trees. And this Māori flute is made in the shape of her cocoon.
Flutes are renowned as feminine culturally, and horns or trumpets are renowned as masculine. So I would actually like to consider the reverse of that question, or the inverse, which is, are men allowed? Because if our greatest role model and the atua that is the one that brought it to us is a woman, then maybe all I can do is look after it. Maybe it's not actually mine, right?
Well, this flute here, you see, it has both voices. It can be played as a flute, if your lips are right in that. But then, because the story of the moths is an amazing one, that only the male one turns into a flying moth, and the female one stays inside there to nourish the babies. And in fact, she gives her life for it. But when they mate, there's part of the male one in there, and so this flute can be played from that end, or I think he's crying to be let out with that particular chord. But so, yeah, there's that duality that's often there. So I think that answers the question too, that both male and female are noted as playing traditionally. Some areas, we might have had different rules, but I think when you look at the composition of this, the unique flute of the Māori, and the most important one because it is the house of the goddess of flute music, the question answers itself.
Another question.
Yes.
How about... Oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
I have a microphone, yeah.
You have the power.
You speak of the range of the instruments that you've shown us. The piano behind you has not always looked the way it does or sounded the way it does. Do you see these instruments developing in the way that Western instruments have to increase their range and the variety of the things they can do?
There are makers who have been working on that sort of thing. The only ones that I know of that have, with the most common one, the kawawa that I showed you earlier, they've been people who've come from overseas and don't have the background of understanding how important it is to value tradition, I think, because it's not part of their tradition, so it's easily understandable. But the sound that they make, because it's so special, it just does something inside us. And one of the little flutes that I'm hopeless at, but it's
What a bag of goodies.
made of a gourd. Well, it wasn't originally made of a gourd, but the gourds are so delicate that when I was moving overseas, I made one out of wood instead, so that I would know it was still alive when I got somewhere. And this is the true nose flute of the Māori. And like Richard says, I make sound, so don't expect too much. But the gourd instruments, because as mentioned before, the mother of all the gourds is the goddess of peace. And we found, before we knew that sound, we were making instruments, just looking at pictures from the past and pieces in the museum, we found that all the instruments that were made of gourds, and there's a whole range of ones, but this tiny little one here sort of really encapsulates the peaceful sound. And twice I've seen these played with Down syndrome children in the audience, and they've just got up and danced and moved around and articulated sounds. They're completely taken with something. We get too sophisticated and won't let ourselves have that happen to us, I think. But it's just amazing to see that little tiny sound just encapsulates the story that goes with it. Of peace.
And maybe also to add to that question, if you created a kawawa with a very large range, if you were wanting to play music which sounded authentic, you'd only use a little bit of it. So why would you? Yeah, you see what I mean? I mean, if I was to actually, you made for me some time ago. We were doing a show which was about Irish music, and we wanted to represent very old Irish music. Okay, almost prehistoric. Music that we didn't know. And Brian made this kawawa with six holes in it, because the modern Irish flute has 6 holes, and we experimented a little, and yes, it was interesting for that project, but it isn't an instrument I would use to play.
I think
yeah.
I think I get really conflicted again by this authenticity thing. I think it was actually Richard who said to me that there was no such thing. as authentic. And I just wonder, what is it that makes Māori music? Is it, say for me, is it because I'm Māori? So when I play the guitar, or is it, so, I mean, there's so many layers, you know. Is it that I sing in te reo? Is it that I sing a traditional song? Is it that I play kōauau? Or maybe I play... this was something that I had in my research around making. Okay, so making the kōauau, one of the traditional methods for making kōauau was using a hot coal to burn through the bore of the flute to create the shaft of the flute. Is it a kōauau if it's not made that way? And of course, at some point, it actually isn't, I guess, because the boundary around authenticity is confused. Of course, that's not the case as well. All right.
A little story that might round it off.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, you.
Yeah. Do you have the story?
The goddess of flute music in here. And there's a story goes that when Maui, the trickster and the demigod of Maui mythology, he wanted to get control of fire for mankind, and he had to go to his grandmother to get it from her. And he was tricking her something awful, and so the last piece that she had that could create fire, she threw it at him, and it went into the trees beside him and set fire to the trees, and he was about to get burned up, but he changed himself into he was one of these shape changes, you know, that the kids talk about, and he turned into a hawk and escaped, but the hawk got singed and there's just this browny colour. But when he got back to the other birds in safety, he needed water to change himself back into his real shape. And of course, the birds, being Maui, who was always playing tricks on people, yeah, right, no, not having anything to do with you, and being Maui, who did all sorts of things that would put them off. Finally, the tiny little robin came along and brought a wee drop of water. It wasn't enough to do it, but he got a reward of his legs being stretched out, so he hops around on the floor of the forest and he doesn't get his tummy wet. And then Kōkako, who was a vain bird and, you know, wanted to be, a wannabe, like me, yeah. He went and got the water, and Maui said, well, you can have some of your wishes granted. His first wish was to get the wattles like the huia had, because it's the most elegant of all birds. And one of his last wishes was to be able to sing like Rokatori, the little caterpillar. And you say, a caterpillar can sing? Yeah, right. But I have talked to one old kuia up north where there are often great congregations of these. They strip the trees. And she was called out by her grandmother to come and listen to one night. There must have been enough of them making this tiny noise that a caterpillar could make to make it audible. And anyhow, this little noise, that was the sweetest song of all, because she was the goddess of flute music. And Kōkako said, I'd really love to sing like she does. And Maui laughed at that. He said, dead easy. You just have to squeeze from the bottom, and when the caterpillar comes out the top, you eat it. You eat enough, and you get a lovely song. And that is still the favourite food of the kōkako. But in eating that, he gains her voice. And he's known as the purest noted songbird in the world. And I saw on the computer the music Bob was doing, and one of his notes, instead of being like this, like music is a rectangle of pure sound. And of course, what happens when he sings? The other birds copy. And what happens when he listens? He copies. And so Reese, who's spent his life trying to find the South Island kōkako, says, well, there are a few things that happens. Sometimes you hear a deer barking, and you realise that's a kōkako. and you hear other sounds that are alien to his traditional song. And then sometimes he says, I'm here, I hear a sound, and it's not on my tape recorder down there. They can throw their sound. So, of course, that's a great model for us. And we're a bit useless. We're not even as clever as a bird. We can't do that. So we have to make a whole plethora of different instruments trying to capture part of that sound. But he set the pattern. He copies. He extends his old song. It answers the question, doesn't it?
It does.
On that wonderful story, and it was wonderful, Brian, we will finish because there are other people coming in here. Please join us next door if you want to have a close look at some of the instruments. But would you please thank Gillian Whitehead, Rob Thorne and Brian Flintoff for a fascinating conversation this morning.